So Luz, thank you for being here with us
Well,
today.
thank you for inviting me. I'm
And
honored.
would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself just generally before we get into the question and answers?
Oh, that's a loaded question right there. This whole thing was going to be about myself, so I didn't prepare how to
Oh
intro
no, that's
myself.
okay. Well, I can. Well, let's dig right into it because like I said, this is kind of like an informal lunch chat to really dig into
Yeah,
your
that's
rich
like the
history.
hardest question in a job interview. Is like, so
Tell us
tell me
about
about
yourself.
yourself.
So let's start with your connection to the Lower East Side and the East Village, and I mentioned you were born, you're a native New Yorker, but let's talk a little bit about where you grew up and what we were just talking about, your daily walks as a child.
Yeah, my parents moved into an apartment on 9th Street between 2nd and 3rd when I was 5 years old. And during that time, they brought over my mother's parents, who moved into St. Mark's Place, which is 8th Street between 2nd and 3rd, right around the corner. And my mother's siblings all moved into apartments nearby. So I had my Aunt Lillian and Uncle Kelly on 8th Street between 1st and 2nd. My Aunt Miriam was on 2nd Avenue between 8th and 9th. So that was like a real hometown stomping grounds for me, once I was allowed to venture out after I was 5. But I remember the move-in date, even though I was 5, I remember that day because there was this little girl who was a year younger than me, Elisa, who was sitting in the steps watching us move in. So I sat next to her and she became like my best buddy from age 5 to age 18. And I actually moved out with her and her mom when her mom moved out of the building. And so, yeah, we were talking just before this about how her apartment was right above mine. So it was the same layout. Uh, but because they were white and Jewish, and we were Puerto Rican recent arrivals, in terms of my parents, the apartments were so different, the different smells, the different textures. Everything was different, even though it was like a whole nother world upstairs. And I would stay upstairs as long as I could because they had cushy rugs on the floor. And we would play Barbie doll on the cushy rugs on the floor as opposed to my linoleum floor downstairs. But my mom would bang on the pipes, and she would have a distinct. I have my French press here, so I can do it. She would go with a distinct tap on the heating pipes, the heaters. There was
Yeah.
these long pipes in the corner of tenements, and that would mean my father was on his way home from work,
So you
and
had to
I
get
had to run
downstairs.
downstairs. And God forbid if her father came to take her to Comine Street Pool up on like the West Village,
Yeah.
and I was invited, my mom would be panicked because my hair would be wet and she would have to dry my hair, which was like really, really long. So my father wouldn't know that I went to Carmine Street Pool because like he was not happy about me hanging out with them. But anyway,
Yeah.
but since they both worked most of my life, I really lived on St. Mark's Place on 8th Street between 2nd and 3rd, where my grandparents lived. And my grandma, I was named after, Luz Elena. I'm Luz Marina. She's Luz Elena, and my father's mother was Marina. So I was named after my 2 grandmas. So she was Mommy Lucci. They call me Mama Luz, but she was Mommy Lucci because she would take care of everybody's kids. She was like the original family daycare center.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like what we eventually, called family daycare.
Daycare. Yeah.
She was original family daycare where she would take care of a bunch of kids. And yeah, so living on St. Mark's Place back then, there were beatniks, and then there were hippies, and then there were yippies, and I saw all the trends change right on that block on St. Mark's Place, because it was right across the street from the Electric Circus. So even though I wasn't allowed to go in, I would see all the comings and goings. And to this day, there's the most interesting shops on that block. So you could spend hours and hours just window shopping as a kid. My favorite store was Bowl and Board. It was right under the comic book store. I don't know if it's still there. And it had like 2 storefronts under the stoop. And the whole place was like a warehouse of wood bowls and plates, and everything was wood. So it smelled really good. And I miss that store. I have not found a store
like that.
in all my living years.
That's incredible, Luz. And I think it speaks, just your lived experience speaks to the diversity of the area and the impact the area had on culture. I mean, like you said, it all started there. You saw it change, and then it went to the general US culture. I mean,
right.
I
Yeah, but it started there before it spread to the US culture. And yeah, so I was privy to what was coming to the fore.
Yeah. And could you tell us about your walk? I really think it's fascinating, the walks you would take, because living on the east side, you know, some people might have felt isolated there, but you really spanned the whole village from all the way
people on the
east to
east
west.
side stayed on the east side. People on the west side stayed on the west side, but not me. I was in the middle. I went to school on the east side. I went to PS 122 when it was a school on First Avenue and 9th Street. It really was a PS, Public School 122.
Yeah.
It kept its name after, you know, became a community center, an art center, right? So, but I went to school there for elementary years, and then I went to junior high school 60 on 12th Street between First and A. But all my friends from school lived on the east side. So after school, I would go spend some time at my friend Alba's house on Avenue D. My other friends, Lois and Carlita, were in, I think, the Lillian Wall Project, somewhere around Avenue D or C. And so then I would walk back home and then do my walk to the west side, because all the shops were fascinating to me and they were always changing. So I would walk on one side and do all the window shopping all the way to 6th Avenue. And then I turned back around, go to Washington Square Park, and then walk back on 8th Street on the other side. Yeah, what came to mind was when I would hit 6th Avenue, there was a women's prison there. And it was just so shocking and traumatizing when I found out that that's what that noise was, the women screaming out the window. And for some time, I didn't realize that that was a prison. I just thought, you know, just a lot of loud women live in that building. But as I grew older, I realized that what an odd place to have a women's prison in such a like touristy, commercial area. You know, there was art, there was stores, there was tourists, there was just so much good stuff going on, and then this woman's prison. So
and I think that's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It was just odd.
Yeah.
There was a lot of odd things about my childhood. That's why a lot of people think I'm odd.
I think you're fascinating and you're so impactful. And before we move on from childhood, because this is really very interesting, what I wanted to say about the prison is when we talk about the history, a lot of people say like Mae West was there. And so that was a really long time ago. And people think it was a really long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago and that it was there. And so it wasn't like the village wasn't what we know it now when the prison was there. So you're right. It's kind of like an odd place that why was it still there when so much else was going on in the area? And then you told me the fascinating story about the jeweler in the neighborhood about St. Mark's. Would you talk a little bit about that?
My grandparents were kind of boring to be with all day long, so they would let me go outside, and there was a jewelry store right below, right next to the entrance of 30 St. Mark's Place. I don't know what's there now, but the jeweler would bring tables out onto the street and put up a tent, and he would have all the rings. And at that time, I remember hippies used to love toe rings because they used to walk barefoot on St. Mark's Place. And my parents were appalled because I was wearing toe rings with sandals, but they were afraid I was going to start taking my sandals off. With the hippie trend, it was so much fun because everything was bells and jangles, and I used to emanate some of it, which freaked my parents out because hippies would literally be walking barefoot. I can't explain that, but they had really cool toe rings with bells. So the jeweler would like be selling toe rings and earrings, and he would make them right there as he sat at the table. And he would welcome me to sit with him, and he would teach me how to wire beads, and use the pliers and make earrings. And fast forward for when I went to college at NYU for my undergrad studies, I used to make earrings and put them in a portfolio. And when I'd have a lunch break or whenever I had a break, I would sit at Washington Square Park, my campus, and open up the portfolio and sell earrings. That's how I got through college, selling earrings and serving cappuccinos at Cafe Reggio, which is another story.
Do you want to talk about Cafe? I mean, that's a very big institution in the village, Cafe Reggio. What was it like?
I was the waitress at Cafe Reggio when I was in college for a while, because the owner of the establishment was really very, very, very stern. And it was kind of oppressive being a waitress there, because it just felt like you had this like really, disciplinarian father overlooking everything you did. But I learned how to be a really good waitress, and that got me through any time I had a hard, economic situation. I knew I could waitress, and he would walk around and check the sugar spoons. I had to make sure that the customers didn't like wet the spoon from the sugar bowl in their coffee and then put it back.
Okay.
And the sugar would stick on the spoon. That's how detailed my training was.
Wow, that's
so he would check the sugar spoons to see whether I had checked the sugar spoons. But you met a lot of interesting people at Cafe Reggio. I remember when I no longer worked there, I used to love going back, just watching people and eating their quiche, which was really unique. But I learned all about cappuccinos. To this day, I am a coffee fiend. I got my French press right
there.
But there was something that I got reminded of when I was talking about waitressing. After 9/11, there was about a year or so that I had gotten laid off and wasn't working, and I got a job as a cater waiter, and I was on call, and I would just drive to weddings and bar mitzvahs with a tuxedo and a white gloves, and I took the training really well because I was like really well groomed at Cafe Reggio, because it was another very strict type of work. It was, everything was timed, everything was choreographed.
Yeah.
Mhm. But yeah, I got through the lean years after 9/11 by being a cater waiter.
Yeah. How it's so funny. We've known each other for so long. That's how I got through college, is I did cater
Oh
waiter.
yeah, and we never we
Had
never
no
knew
idea
that
I
about
was
each other.
yeah.
Well, it's not like the first thing you talk about when they tell you, "Tell me about yourself."
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. I mean, yeah, I can't imagine all the amazing people you saw at Cafe Reggio. And I mean, we're already talking about this, but like, if you could distill it a little bit, what the community and the many communities you kind of moved through in the village from the east to the west,
On a daily
how did that
basis.
impact your, like, shape your life and work to come? I mean, already like the training at Cafe Reggio helped and things, but anything
Right.
else you'd want to highlight? And the earrings, but anything else you'd like to highlight that was special about growing up in this area?
Well, in terms of how it affected my professional life later, was that from a very early age, I believe the age of getting your working papers, I don't know if that is still a thing, but back then,
It was when I was working, but that was a long time ago too. So I don't know.
I think you were 14. If you wanted to work, you needed working papers. And uh, that's when you could get a job with summer youth employment. And because I was in the Lower East Side and most of my friends were on the East Side, I was exposed to all these community organizations that were doing youth leadership and youth development through getting funds for SYEP, Summer Youth Employment program. I got to have these fascinating jobs. Um, and they always included community organizing and the melding of arts and social justice. Like there wasn't a separation. Like if you were in an art organization learning how to silk screen, which was a memory, or a photography, in the dark room. I learned all these skills, but it all had to do with exposing injustices around housing and tenant rights. So if you were doing a poster, it's nice that you're learning how to do a poster, but the poster had to be about social justice. So arts and social justice was a really fortunate experience for me at a young age. And one of the SYP jobs I had was to clean out an abandoned building, which turned out to be the first homesteaded building on the Lower East Side on 11th Street, 519 East 11th Street. And I did enough sweat equity through my entry through summer youth employment that I was able to get an apartment there um, when I was old enough. So it
That's
was
amazing. How did that work, Luz? Because I mean, something we should bring back, I think. It's from the sound of it.
it's totally amazing. It was totally amazing, and it started a whole movement of homesteaders. Um, but it wasn't an easy thing, and not all of them survived. I know there's one on 10th Street that a friend of mine lives in. She's like been a homesteader for decades. But you have to deal with all the people in the building, and that's not easy.
Yeah.
Diversity is not easy because
Yeah.
then you have to deal with people that are not like you, and you know there's all sorts of um, complications
Yeah.
around co-ownership of an entire building.
Yeah.
And I was young. I was like 18, 19, and it was just too much for me. I was trying to get into school. into college. I had taken a gap year between high school and college, and then it required another year when I was trying to get independent status so that I can get financial aid,
Yeah.
because I was independent by then.
Hmm.
And it required another year of independence in order to prove I was independent. So my gap year turned into 2 years. But the reason I wanted that gap year was that um, I was so passionate about the community organizing and all of the work I was doing in the Lower East Side that I really wanted to focus on that before going to college.
Yeah.
And during that time, I got to do the sweat equity at 519, and I got an apartment. And when I finally got a scholarship to go to Pratt Institute, because that was my first 2 years of college,
Yeah.
was at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn.
Hmm.
Um, I left. I left. I regretted it the rest of my life. Like, I could have had an apartment on freaking 11th Street all this time. Um, but I did the best that I could with what I knew at the time. You
At the
know that
time.
saying, you do the best you can with what you got at the time.
Yeah.
And I felt that staying in the Lower East Side with the the chaotic type of cooperative, was
Yeah.
an experiment.
Yeah.
It was an experiment. And so it was just too much for then me to focus on college.
Yeah.
If it, my college years got delayed 2 years, I don't want anything to interfere with it. So I
Hmm.
literally moved to Brooklyn to, an apartment right by campus
Campus. Yeah.
to focus on college, because I was independently, like, didn't have anybody else to count on in
Yeah.
terms of my financial survival. So that's what I did. I left.
Yeah.
I
But
left the homestead and went to Penn Institute.
and I think, but what's so fascinating, and we can start talking a little bit more about your professional career, is how you've been such a leader in diversity, and that understanding that you gained of it's tough, and the skills you gained, even if you chose to then focus on school. I think it served you through your whole career, including now with your consulting with Visionary Allies. That's a core component. And for me, I can trust you in that as someone coming to you because you
Absolutely.
lived it.
Absolutely. Because my core training in the successful models
Yes.
was through Charas El Bohío and being mentored by Chino Garcia and Armando Perez and the founders of that organization, because they would have board meetings that were led like collectives. And even though I was a teenage kid, I was in a board meeting. Like, they were very inclusive of the different generations, and very inclusive of people. Like, there was this homeless guy who didn't seem all there mentally, and he had chicken legs in his pocket, and, like, literally like an odd man. But he was included in a lot of things. And I learned how, after I left the Lower East Side, how unique that experience was for me in all these formative years. First, there was like an artistic renaissance there, but there was a renaissance of social justice and collective leadership, collective shared leadership models that I very seldom see replicated. And it was sort of a, since then, and it was sort of a culture shock when I left the Lower East Side, because things were segregated. things were not as diverse as I thought the
Yeah.
world was.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to think now, especially since 2020, so many, even companies like Fortune 500 companies are trying to figure out the shared leadership model. Like it's the new thing, but it's the thing that's been driving so much social change and justice in the Lower East Side forever. So that's fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of those organizations you worked with in your youth and then
Well, by
during after
then,
college?
I knew how to ride a bike. And I also knew how to use the subway system. So my world expanded to the 5 boroughs. But the organizations that really groomed me in terms of leadership development of young people, me and my peers, was Charas El Bohío on 10th Street, but they were on Cherry Street early on when they were first founded. So I had a proximity to Charas on Cherry Street and Henry Street Settlement. And on Henry Street. And Henry Street Settlement was all about youth development and youth leadership skills. And it was just such a rich experience biking from Charas to Henry Street Settlement. And watching, it was mostly the guys, but it was still fun to watch because there wasn't any sports. Like I wasn't like exposed to sports teams like some high schools have. But at Henry Street Settlement, there was fencing, there was basketball for the program called Operation Athlete, but it was preparing them to get sports scholarships. So like after they were trained in a specific sport like fencing or basketball, they would be bused to all these colleges around the country for coaches to see them perform. And it was all around getting them scholarships.
Wow.
So Operation Athlete, even though I wasn't one of the athletes, was something that I was exposed to and part of Henry Street Settlement that, really impressed me. And I ended up being asked to be director of youth employment at a young age. And I was like, Jim Robinson was the mentor there. And it was an example of someone else seeing leadership skills in you and how leadership is about developing leadership in others. And so because that was the way it was done for me, like Chino Garcia and the late Armando Perez would include me in board meetings, would include me in proposal sessions, and Henry Street Settlement would include me in proposal writing sessions and budgeting sessions and give me leadership responsibility at a young age for me to figure it out, but with others mentoring me. That is just what they instilled in me, is that once you get it, then you got to give it back. So like once you get it, then you needed to mentor someone else. So that was my training for my professional life then on,
Yeah.
which included leadership positions in different nonprofit organizations. But at the same time, it was the New Yorican Poets Cafe that would pull me in to read my, what poems I might have written, and do I want to read them tonight at the cafe? And Teatro Ambulante was there teaching me bomba en plena, Puerto Rican, Afro-Puerto Rican dance and music, where I learned about my culture. So I was building my identity along with building professional skills. I didn't know I was building my professional skills I was just having a whole lot of fun.
Fun.
I was freaking having a ball.
That's
You know,
amazing.
and I remember having this huge argument with my mother because she was like really worried about me. I would be too as a
Yeah.
mother. You know, like you're 15, you're out there hanging out with ex-gang members. I'm like, yeah, but now they're community organizers. You got to
United.
understand.
Hmm.
They're listening to Buckminster Fuller, which she wasn't going to understand, that he
Hmm.
was this genius that invented the geodesic dome and was talking about alternative lifestyles. And a lot of poor people are out there, and these gang members are not gang members anymore. They're community organizers, and they're teaching me a lot of stuff. And she was just like, no. All she heard was ex-gang member.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I told her the story about the guy with the chicken in his pocket. Like, look, even homeless people are being helped. You know, I was trying to
Hmm.
explain as best I could to a panicked mother why I
Yeah.
wasn't in college yet, and you know why I wasn't home much. and and she says, "What's that man's name?" Because I was saying that meetings would stop if Jorge Brandon, which was his name, would
Hmm.
walk in, because he would have these poems that he would recite without notes or anything, and they could
Hmm.
go on for like 30, 40 minutes. It was
Wow.
like, and it sounded like a Spanish Shakespeare.
Hmm.
And even if you didn't understand it all, it was just fascinating hearing him recite. And
Yeah.
so in my young mind, I understood that even though he was creepy looking and he hadn't taken a bath in a long time,
Yeah.
that there was a reason why my mentors welcomed him in
Hmm.
any setting we were in.
Yeah.
And then my mother, who was often ill and in bed, and I'm like, if you could picture this, she's in bed, you know, like this, and I'm standing over her, telling her, like, I'm really doing something good. You shouldn't
Yeah.
be worried about me. And I was telling her about Jorge Brandon, and she sat up and she says, "What's his name?" I'm like, "Jorge Brandon." And she was from Ponce, Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And in Puerto Rico, every small town has a little, what do you call it? Like a little park with a fountain,
Like a
and
town square sort of
a little
thing.
town square. Every little town has a town square in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
And in her day, when she was young, the men mostly
Hmm.
would come and dress up and recite poetry at the town square.
Oh, yeah.
And she remembers Jorge Brandon, who would show
Wow.
up in all white with his suit and tie
Hmm.
and recite poetry. And that was what bonded me and my mom. And she never questioned
Wow.
me again about being a community organizer in the Lower East Side, after she went through all these pains to get me on Second Avenue so I wouldn't be
The
in
Lower
the
East Side,
Lower
yeah.
East Side. Um, but it was the fact that she remembered him when he was young and elegant, and we don't know what happened to him, but
Hmm.
she recognized him as a really highly respected poet in Puerto Rico. And the adults around me in the Lower East Side knew that he was a highly respected
It's a
poet.
poet.
You know, he had lost it, you know, in some respects, but he still had his poetry in his head.
Yeah. And how fascinating the real life connection of social justice and art in your life.
Oh my
That
God, yeah, yeah. Oh my God, and the fact that that bonded or like bridged the generation
Mhm.
gap between me and my mom. You know
And
that
I can't imagine it happening anywhere else
then the
in the
Lower East Side,
world, really. You
then the
know.
Lower East Side.
That's really powerful, Luz. And I also want to highlight, just from my own experience working with you, for those who are watching, Luz and I worked for many years at Foundation Center together, which is now called Candid, in the training program. And you mentored me. I mean, the hours you spent with me mentoring me, and then all the thousands of people who would come through our doors for our free trainings. And when you traveled, to hear you tell the story and reflect back on how you were physically doing that on a daily basis, and sharing that leadership is very powerful and beautiful to think about. So I just wanted to highlight that, because
that was the one thing I really admired about the Foundation Center, now called Candid, was how they matched jobs to people. Like, they gave me like the perfect job for me.
Yeah. And the impact of on literally thousands of people a year that you would reach, sharing that knowledge.
And I got the job. They were like, we're looking for someone that can take all the trainings that we have and combine it with, nonprofit experience, and community experience, and then translate it in Spanish. And I didn't know it at the time, even though I did feel like I had checked all the boxes of the qualifications. I really realized afterwards how it was like a really perfect job for me. I was like in my element. I would go into my zone when I would teach the classes, and people would say how fascinating it was. And I'm like, what did I say? I was just really loving that job. And I also noticed how other people who worked there were matched so impeccably to their acumen, and their skills, or their talents, right?
Yeah. And I think it just makes so much sense how, like, you can go into a class and someone's teaching you something because they were taught to teach it, versus you were teaching it from very real life experience from a very young age. And so that we would even get young people sometimes to come in, and you were great with them. So let's talk a little bit more about your executive director experience and some of the other kind of highlights in your career that you might want to talk about, whether it was down in the Lower East Side, or then once you started to travel, how you took those learnings with you.
So when I became director of youth employment services, I created at Henry Street Settlement Youth Employment Services, I created the acronym YES. Say yes to your future. I expanded it to include basic education for a lot of young people that were not literate. So then we had this basic ed program. Then we expanded and got grants to do outreach to homeless youth. At that time, there were a lot of homeless families in hotels in Manhattan in the 80s. And we would actually send counselors out to the hotels to get the kids to come to Henry Street Settlement.
That's incredible. And a lesson we need right now, because this is a similar trend we're seeing. I just saw it in the Louis Armstrong school that's near me. Teachers just started a mutual aid free store with things because they're facing so many kids just don't have homes right now.
Yeah, and they're often the least thought about and forgotten, and they go through a really hard time. And they go through a really hard time afterwards getting into the foster care system, because that's what would happen to a lot of them.
Yeah.
And with one particular family, I was really worried about one young girl whose family was being split up and put into the foster care system. And I basically adopted her, Judy Herrera. She became my foster child.
That's incredible.
Unofficially at first, but then officially. And then I was recruited to be co-executive director of the Lower East Side Family Resource Center. and there was a really nice design that I was charged with helping women who were developing family daycares in their homes. So I would help
Wow.
set their homes up to pass certification.
Yeah.
And then Barbara, I forgot her last name, the other director would be the one to keep track of women or support working women who needed childcare.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And we would
So you
match,
bridged the gap.
the working women that needed childcare to the women who were setting up the family daycare.
Wow.
Is that nice?
That is an incredible model.
Yeah. And then we had a family room for everybody to come hang out with their kids.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, yeah, it was very, very cool. Then one day, this woman shows up, I forgot her name, who, but I'm sorry, it's researchable because she was executive director of the Washington Heights Ecumenical Food Pantry. And for some reason, we had met somehow, and she came to my office to tell me that she was leaving her post and she'd like me to replace her. And I looked at her, I'm like, what are you talking about? I mainly work with women and youth. And she said, I'd like you to come by the food pantry and see who's on the food line. It was mostly women and youth.
Yeah.
And she convinced me to take the job. She said it's really not that hard, you know, everything's in place. She lied. But I was duped into thinking that it wasn't going to be a hard job.
Job.
And I ran the Washington Heights Ecumenical Food Pantry for 6 years in Washington
Wow.
Heights. I remember that I was such a New Yorker, I never learned to drive.
Yeah.
But at that time, I was raising 2 sons and a stepson that occasionally came and a foster child that occasionally came on weekends. And there was gang activity on Avenue, well, where we lived, we were on Avenue B and 6th Street, right across the street from Andrew Glover Youth Program.
Oh.
Luz Rodriguez was a friend of mine, and he would keep first offenders out of prison by advocating for them in court. And he knew all the judges. And he was such a hero. He was another superhero of the Lower East Side. And he's still doing it. God bless him. But I knew that after school, my boys would go there.
Yeah.
Because I trusted Angel staff to keep them safe.
Yeah.
And I believe it was one of them that let me know that there was a gang trying to recruit Abran, my son.
Oh, wow.
Who is now like the leading, you know, entrepreneur in AI, like he was so gifted. But had I not moved out of there, things might have been different. Because he was being recruited, and he was at an age where he wanted to be independent and didn't want to be locked up at home like I was. I, you know, resisted as well. And the Lower East Side was a whole nother place. Like back when I was a kid, there was gang members, there were drug addicts, but there was some kind of code of honor where they didn't mess with kids. Like they didn't, or they would protect us.
Yeah.
Or if they did, you know, if they were doing drugs, they would do it away from us.
Yeah.
And they would make sure that the seedy people would stay away from us. But that wasn't the case when I was raising my kids.
Yeah.
So one of the women in Washington Heights, by then I was at the Dominican Women's Development Center also. When Rosita Romero had her first pregnancy, she recruited me to be the interim executive director. And one of the women there said, well, we're right across the river from New Jersey. All you have to do is take the bus across the bridge and go look at some apartments. And that's what I did. I would take the bus across the bridge and found an apartment in Palisades Park and shipped my boys out, and didn't know how to drive. So I didn't have a car to like do laundry and do groceries, and like you needed a car out there. So I would have a driving school instructor come pick me up at my job at lunchtime and teach me how to drive at lunchtime.
Wow, that's incredible.
So I was basically running like a group home at home, a food pantry, some part-time work at Dominican Women's Development Center, and driving lessons at lunchtime. And so I ended up having to leave the food pantry because that's when I learned about executive director burnout.
Yeah.
And that's why I coach executive directors now through Visionary Allies. I tell them I'm not an expert at what to do, but I'm an expert at what not to do. So I'm going to share like all the mistakes I made so that you are not making the same mistakes. Like made new ones, but not
the same.
Yeah. I just took on too much. And partly because I could do it all, so there was a positive side to it. But when you're a jack of all trades, you have to not do it all.
Do it all. I was going to say that would burn anyone out.
No, you could do it. No, what I tell my clients, you could do it all for a max 3 years. And then you'll burn out. Or if you want longevity at a position, then you can't do it all.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And they literally take my advice. I have a client who's an executive director who keeps reminding her staff, I'm here for 3 years.
Oh, good for her.
I'm here for 3 years.
Yeah.
I told them, and they keep looking surprised when I tell them, okay, 1 year has passed. I'm here for 2 years.
2 years left.
They don't get it.
Well, I think because it's so rare for people to have such clarity, and that's thanks to your guidance. So let's move ahead and talk a little bit about getting your master's in nonprofit leadership at Fordham. And so we're moving outside of the village, but obviously that had an impact, and Fordham's a key place in New York City. Could you talk a little bit, because you were in the first cohort for the program that you graduated from?
I was actually back when I was at the Family Resource Center. I got a full ride for graduate school at NYU because there was a special program for executive directors of color. And I lasted maybe 1 or 2 semesters. It was a really tough example of not being able to do it all, because I was doing it all. I was a single mom. I was an executive director. I was still doing social justice organizing. And of course I could do graduate school. It's a free ride. What am I going to say? No. But my mom died like midterms, and then during finals, my aunt died. And having those 2 deaths in 1 semester, and I had this problem with whenever I would open a book at home to do homework, I would hear "Mom," and it was like, like I wanted a witness. Like every time I opened the
every
book,
single time,
hear "Mom, watch, Mom." And I walked away. I was telling my kids over Thanksgiving a whole bunch of stuff that they didn't know. and how I had walked away from, graduate school. And then the Fordham started this program for nonprofit leadership, and I was at Foundation Center, and I found like I was passed over quite a lot with promotions, and I would look up, like, compare my skills to the skills that people were being promoted with, and wondered what the hell. The only difference is that they have a master's. So I wanted my master's. And when I graduated and got my master's in nonprofit leadership, I was 59. It was
Incredible.
a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a big deal. And I really appreciated that, because what I learned at Fordham, because I was going thinking I wasn't going to learn all that much. I kind of know all this stuff. I just wanted
because
a
you needed
credential.
the credential.
And that was true for the fundraising class. Like, the fundraising teacher would say something and all the students would look at me like, is that right? It was really funny. And sometimes I would not agree. But I would say the Foundation Center says something different. Like some professors are like 10 years behind. But anyway, I did learn a lot that helped me then give me the confidence to start my own consulting firm as Visionary Allies, and really filled the gaps in knowledge that I had around organizational development, board development. And I had some aha moments like, oh, that's why things don't work, because that's the way it's supposed to look. And, I share those gaps with people because that's where the learning is. Like, most nonprofits that I was exposed to had board members that had no idea how to be a board member, and no one ever told them what their obligations were or what their expectations were. We just kind of winged it. Everybody's winging it. And that's where a lot of power plays come into the fore. And now when I started teaching basic board development to some nonprofit boards, they were incredulous, like, no, we can't do that. I'm like, well, that's the way it works. Actually, you're doing it illegally. Like, no, you can't have the president of the board be the executive director of an organization. Oh, but we've done it for 10 years. Yeah, well, that's why I'm here, not to tell you before you get sued.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about Visionary Allies and kind of your future goals, and then we'll wrap up. So tell us more about your consulting.
I thought Visionary Allies, actually, because you would understand, most of all, because of our years together at Foundation Center, I decided for my business plan was that Visionary Allies was going to be a prospect research firm for small to mid-sized nonprofits, because only the big nonprofits had enough money and staff to do prospect research. And then the small to mid-size always struggling with fundraising because they don't have anybody dedicated for, consistent prospect research, right? So that was my brilliant idea for Visionary Allies. However, one of my first contracts, I'm sorry, the strategy was also what I learned at Foundation Center about the power of collaboration. So I was going to collaborate with other consultants and share profits. And that if we referred each other to clients, we would each get a percentage of that contract, even if it's a small percentage. But there was part of the business design was to get consultants collaborating and sharing income. Consultants started inviting me because of what I had introduced to collaborate with them, but it was all around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not your typical DEI diversity trainings. These were really brilliant consultants that were doing anti-oppression work and really wanted to do genuine diversity education. And that experience really changed the trajectory of my business and my focus. And I did that quite successfully for 2-3 years before COVID hit. And when COVID hit and there wasn't any more traveling around doing trainings, I pivoted to coaching over Zoom and over the phone. But that was also coming out of the diversity trainings that we did. Those trainings would leave people feeling like they needed to process more. And it would be suggested that they get coaching from me. Most of the teams that I would work with are younger, which were, great, brilliant consultants, but how the coaching would go, they would kind of look to me as the older consultant, and it's what I'm good at. It's my jam. So, that has been pretty much a really good change for me, because now I've decided to just work part-time and retire part-time, and I can coach and still retire and retire and still coach.
Yeah.
And so I have also a really wonderful peek at the new emerging generation of leaders that the nonprofit world really needed.
Yeah.
We always knew at Foundation Center that there was going to be this generational transition.
Yeah.
Founding directors that were like 20, 30 years in their organizations eventually having to move, and we didn't know what was going to replace that. Right? Who was going to replace that? Who's preparing them for that?
Yeah.
And we basically heard about it in the philanthropy side as well, that the shift in wealth, the transition of wealth was going to happen. But I also saw that, because of my experience, that meant there's going to be a transition of leadership in the nonprofit organizations as well.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm at. I'm coaching younger executive directors of nonprofits.
That's incredible. And and tell us a little bit about your vision for something in New Jersey with the land you have there.
Oh, that's because I was awarded 3 weeks of respite in wind call. When I went to wind call in the early 90s, I was given 3 weeks of rest. The design was to give rest and repose to overextended, overworked social justice activists. And it was one of the best 3 weeks of my life. It was spent in the mountains of Montana, where I had never been. I went to my first Native American powwow. I had a art studio all to myself.
Wow.
I was fed 3 meals a day and given horseback riding lessons if I wanted to. If I wanted to just sleep, I would sleep. anything I wanted. Like they were just like, come on now. How do I go back? I didn't want
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
But that really, really made an impression in my life. So um, I'd like to replicate that and have it have a small version of that for social justice activists and consultants and overworked social justice folk that could use it, even if it's a day off up in the mountains. And I would drive them, I would feed them, and give them art studio space or workshop space or a space to sleep. And I've got a little piece of land in the mountains of Sussex, New Jersey, where it's a really inspirational, beautiful place to be, even if it's for a few hours. So a mini version of Wind Call, which I'm calling Wind Song, because there's such a breeze up in the mountains that the trees are always like singing. And so the future project for Visionary Allies is to develop little wind song.
That's incredible,
in
Luz.
the
And we didn't even delve into your artistic background or SisterSong. So I think maybe
my
there's a
God,
part two
yeah.
somewhere if you're down for it.
Yeah, I could just hear the women of SisterSong. Like she didn't even mention she co-founded SisterSong.
I mean,
So
it's huge.
there are a lot of stories.
Yeah. So, but thank you for sharing your time and sharing your story. And we're going to archive this and share it widely. And I'm just so grateful for you in my life, and that more people can know you is a privilege for me to share. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, the SisterSong story is archived already with my oral history from then at the Sophia Smith archive at Smith College.
Yeah. So I'll send.
It's available online. We could just put the link somewhere.
I'll include the link with the recording on YouTube. In your bio, and then we'll also email the link for that, and also the photos that you shared with the geodesic
dome.
Yeah,
someone just popped the photo of Buckminster Fuller talking to Gino Garcia, which
wow,
is a classic. So there weren't any questions?
Nope. I think we're gonna end there. I think ending on Little Wind Song is a beautiful place to end. So, well, thank you, Luz. It's always a little awkward at the end of these. We say goodbye and it all goes away in an instant.
No, it's
but,
okay. So, we'll find a day for you to come to Little Wind Song.
Definitely. Okay. Thank you, Luz. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye, same to you.